Did you know that the largest robbery in Brazilian history was carried out in such meticulous detail that even today, more than 2 decades later, the details continue to leave everyone speechless? The robbery of the century, as it became known, wasn't just a daring criminal act, it was a lesson in how patience, planning, and trust can be used to challenge even the most secure institutions. But behind the story of stolen billions, a question remains that no one has been able to fully answer to this day. Where is the money? Before we dive into this enigma, I need to ask you something. If you're fascinated by mysteries like this and want to continue following investigative stories full of twists and turns, subscribe to the channel, like it, and comment below with your thoughts on this case. This helps me a lot, and also helps the video reach more people who, like you, love exploring real-world mysteries. Now, let's begin the story of one of the biggest crimes in Brazilian history, where every step was carefully calculated, and the criminal's escape left us all with the feeling that something is still hidden. Prepare yourself for a journey that will leave you with more questions than answers, because the truth, in the case of the robbery of the century, is still out there, waiting to be uncovered. I can't deny that, as an investigator of unexplained cases, I've seen my fair share of crimes, but the robbery of the century has something special about it, something that stirs anyone's mind. In 1997, when the audacious operation took place, no one imagined that the story that was about to be written would be so complex and layered. What seemed like a simple armed robbery soon became a mystery that to this day we haven't been able to fully unravel. I remember the moment I was called in to investigate. The Central Bank of Fortaleza was at the center of one of Brazil's biggest financial tragedies, and the most intriguing thing, the robbery was so strategic, so planned, that it left everyone involved speechless. Who could have imagined that criminals, armed with patience and cunning, would dig a 78-meter tunnel directly to the bank's vault? What seemed like a simple security breach soon revealed itself to be a complex chess game. During my investigation, I saw how the simplest details were crucial: the way the criminals studied the bank, how they entered and exited unnoticed. All of this made me wonder, how could someone plan something like this without anyone noticing? What seemed like a lapse in surveillance became one of the greatest lessons for financial institutions in Brazil. It was as if a shadow hung over everyone involved. But what still surprised me, and continues to surprise me today, was the silence after the crime. The robbery was successful, but where was the money? And that brings us to the next mystery, the flawless execution of the plan. How did they manage to escape without a trace? I had a feeling that no matter how much we investigated, there would always be more layers to uncover. And what I'm about to tell you now may be the biggest secret this case hides. I remember being at the crime scene for the first time. The central bank seemed imposing, solid, and secure, but something was wrong. There was a hole in the ground, a deep, well-planned tunnel. And what shocked me was the amount of money that had been stolen. 60 million reais. That's more than most people could spend in several lifetimes. It's not just a large sum, it truly makes you think about the impact of this crime, both for those involved and for the country. Imagine being involved in an investigation of this magnitude, where every detail seems to scream mystery at you. With the amount of money stolen, it seemed we were dealing with something far beyond a simple robbery. It was as if the criminals had a greater goal than mere profit. They didn't just rob the bank. They challenged the financial structures of an entire country. And what was most intriguing, no one saw a thing. The money disappeared without a trace. At first, I thought it might be internal fraud or something simpler, but as we progressed, I realized we were facing a much bigger mystery. The scale of the heist wasn't just in its value, but in the sheer audacity of the plan. How could someone dig a 78-meter tunnel and simultaneously plan every step with such precision? The criminals knew exactly where they were going. Every move was meticulously orchestrated, making it all seem even more impossible to solve. I wondered, how could someone be so prepared for a crime of this magnitude, to the point of controlling every detail and even anticipating the authorities' response? And of course, as I delved deeper into the case, more and more questions arose. How did they manage to escape? How did the bank not realize the flaw until after it all happened? These answers were beyond anyone's imagination. And as I delved deeper into this mystery, an even more perplexing question arose. Who was really behind all this? But this is a topic that will take us to the next level of complexity. When the word planning is mentioned, everyone usually thinks of a to-do list. But what I saw in the robbery of the century went far beyond that. Every step, every detail was so meticulously thought out that I could sense the criminal's level of experience and cunning. The first thing that caught my attention was the tunnel. They didn't just dig a simple hole, they created a true feat of engineering. The tunnel, which connected a rented house to the bank vault, was built with such precision that it looked like a professional engineering project. And the most impressive thing, they managed to complete this project without arousing suspicion. Throughout the investigation, I realized that the plan wasn't improvised. They weren't acting impulsively. Everything was thought out, calculated, the way they chose the house, the security of the excavations, the distribution of work among the gang members, all of this indicated they were dealing with an experienced group. The question that lingered in my mind was, how could something like this have happened in the heart of Fortaleza without anyone noticing? The planning was so impeccable that it made me question the extent to which the criminals were manipulating the game. They knew exactly how to avoid every obstacle, how to navigate every security system. I know many people think crimes of this magnitude are hastily planned, but what I discovered was even more frightening. The robbery had been planned for months. It wasn't just a matter of hitting and running, but of how to do it without anyone suspecting anything. The gang knew they needed patience and coordination. Each person involved had a specific role, from those digging the tunnel to those keeping an eye on the bank's activity. It was such a well-assembled puzzle that even I, as an investigator, felt I was dealing with a case beyond my capabilities. And then I realized that, in many moments in life, success comes not from speed or haste, but from preparation. This crime, in particular, was a lesson in how planning can transform the improbable into something entirely possible. But as with any good mystery, the real question that was beginning to emerge was, who was really behind this operation? And what was their ultimate goal? This question, as you can imagine, would open even more frightening doors. Of all the aspects I encountered in this case, the tunnel was undoubtedly the greatest symbol of the lengths the criminals were willing to go to ensure the success of the heist. The image of a deep hole dug into the bowels of the earth, over 78 meters deep, is something I'll never forget. And most impressive, it wasn't just any tunnel. The excavation was done with such precision, using simple tools, but so cleverly that it almost looked like the work of an experienced engineer. It wasn't just a tunnel to reach the safe, it was a project planned to avoid any error, any flaw that could compromise the success of the mission. When I entered the site, where the tunnel connected to the central bank, I was amazed at how the hole was made. It wasn't just a matter of digging and moving from one side to the other. The criminals had planned every detail, the site's security, the vulnerable points, and even the precise time needed to complete the excavation without arousing suspicion. Every inch of earth removed was calculated to ensure that, if anyone were to monitor the operation, it wouldn't be discovered. The tunnel wasn't just an escape route, it was in fact a labor of patience, where the slightest mistake would mean the end of the plan. What struck me most during the investigation was that this tunnel didn't just appear out of nowhere. It had been dug for weeks, but with such caution that it left no visible traces. The criminals proved extremely skilled at going unnoticed. And I, as an investigator, was there, at one of the largest and most mysterious crime scenes in Brazilian history, trying to understand how something so massive could be accomplished without anyone noticing. How was it possible that a project of this magnitude, which would require so much time and effort, had remained hidden for so long? This shook my perception of what can be done in the shadows, without anyone knowing. And since the tunnel connected directly to the bank vault, it became the key to the operation's success. But something told me this connection wasn't the end. On the contrary, it was just beginning to reveal the first layers of what could be an even more complex network, which made me wonder, what would be the next step? How would the story unfold after the execution of such a meticulously crafted plan? This mystery only deepened with each discovery. As I began to unravel the details of the robbery, one thing became clear: time was one of the criminals' greatest allies. The robbery was carried out on a weekend when the central bank was closed, which gave them the perfect window to act uninterrupted. I was used to seeing criminals in a hurry, but in this case, they were patient. They knew that haste could jeopardize everything, so time was used to their advantage in a calculated manner. The operation was carried out with such precision that it seemed like a perfectly functioning clock. There was something almost magical about the criminals' planning. They knew the bank would be empty, yet they maintained constant vigilance to ensure there would be no surprises. At the same time, everything was done with such synchronization that the robbers knew exactly where to be and what to do at every moment. The team was strategically distributed, with well-defined roles, and nothing was left to chance, like an orchestra, where each instrument plays its part at exactly the right time. This made me reflect how many of us underestimate the power of organization and discipline in executing our own plans. The flawless execution of the robbery made me think about how, in life, we often let anxiety and fear get in the way. In many investigations, I've seen people rushing, trying to solve everything at once. But what criminals taught us, almost ironically, is that sometimes the best way to ensure success is to know how to bide your time, knowing when to act and when to back off to ensure the next move will be the most impactful. Now, when I think about this robbery, a question comes to mind that I still haven't been able to fully answer. How did the police and security system not notice anything while it was happening? Time, in fact, was more than just an advantage for the criminals. It was a curtain that hid their every move until it was too late. And this curtain of silence and precision, which enveloped the entire process, has just led us to something even more intriguing. What happened after the robbery? Where was the money? And most importantly, who was really behind it all? When it comes to criminal organizations, the first impression is that everything is disorganized and chaotic. But in the case of the robbery of the century, the organization was impressive. During the investigation, I was challenged to understand how something so complex could be orchestrated by a seemingly simple group of criminals. They weren't your typical desperate thieves, but rather a network of specialists, each with a specific skill that contributed to the heist's success. In particular, the leader of the operation, Antonio Jusivan Lima, stood out for his cunning. He wasn't just a common criminal, but a true strategist. What intrigued me more and more was how someone like him could manipulate this entire scheme with such precision, almost like a conductor conducting an orchestra. Jusivan knew that to carry out a crime of this magnitude, he couldn't rely solely on his own skill. He assembled a team of experts, people with specific knowledge who together formed a network of trust. It wasn't clear how he did it, but the connections he established over the months made the heist possible. What seemed like a simple crime of opportunity was actually the product of a brilliant mind, one that understood that it wasn't just about stealing, but about building the trust and resources necessary for everything to be executed perfectly. Jusivan's leadership. He knew that to ensure the plan wouldn't fail, he needed to be a calculating leader, capable of making quick, coordinated decisions. Each member of the group played a crucial role, from those who remained on the surface, observing the surroundings, to those who actually dug the tunnel and accessed the vault. Jusivan not only organized, but also knew how to inspire his men to follow every detail of the plan to the letter. Loyalty within the group was essential, and he knew how to cultivate it. The organization, contrary to what one might think, was largely responsible for the smooth and successful heist. And as the case progressed, I realized that the arrest of one leader wasn't the end. Other members of the organization, who were behind the scenes, continued to move in the shadows. And this made me wonder, was Jusivan really the mastermind behind it all, or were there more powerful forces at work? And as I tried to understand the true nature of this network, the next great mystery that awaited me seemed even more intriguing. As an investigator, I've always believed that, no matter how complex a crime may be, it never happens without some kind of collaboration or connivance. And in the case of the robbery of the century, one of the questions that kept coming to mind was the possible internal involvement of employees within the central bank itself. The idea that someone within the institution could be helping the criminals plan the robbery seemed surreal at first, but I soon realized that this possibility was more than mere speculation. The bank was full of details that, if closely observed, could suggest a well-structured intelligence network. I remember the first time I spoke to one of the police investigators about this possibility. He looked at me with some skepticism, as if I were going too far, but as I reviewed the data and spoke with some bank employees, I realized that the failures weren't simply the result of a lack of vigilance. There were details in the security reports that indicated certain systems were down or failing at critical moments. This couldn't be a coincidence. Someone inside the bank could have provided the necessary details about the vulnerabilities or even about security schedules and routines. This made me wonder, to what extent can we trust the people who work inside the most secure institutions? The lack of clear records and the absence of images in certain areas also raised further suspicions. How could such a major bank not have a monitoring system that covered all vulnerable points, such as the tunnel the criminals had dug? During the investigation, it became clear that, somehow, the criminals knew exactly where the flaws in the security system were. This awareness could not have been gained through external surveillance alone. It seemed increasingly clear that someone inside the bank had collaborated with the criminals, providing crucial information that facilitated the crime. As I delved deeper into this line of investigation, I began to realize that the bank itself was trying to cover up some of these failures. The idea that an insider had helped with the planning seemed like something the directors and security officials didn't want to admit. The lack of transparency only deepened the mystery, and I knew I was on a dangerous but necessary path. What began as a simple hypothesis now became one of the most important questions in the case. Who within the central bank knew about the plan? And with that question in mind, the case was about to take an even more complex turn. As an investigator, I've always known that vigilance is the first line of defense against any type of crime. But in the case of the robbery of the century, that line of defense seemed to have been breached almost silently, without anyone noticing. I remember being amazed not only by the audacity of the crime, but also by how effectively the criminals exploited flaws in the bank's security system. The central bank, one of Brazil's most important institutions, was involved in a security breach that, in retrospect, seemed almost unforgivable. But who within the institution actually noticed the vulnerability? And most importantly, why didn't they do anything about it? The lack of adequate surveillance was the major flaw. For an institution of such importance, something so significant could not be expected to go unnoticed. What appeared to be a mere technical glitch turned out to be a series of poor choices. Monitoring systems, which should have been fully operational, were either out of commission or experiencing recurring failures. The lack of maintenance and the vulnerability of the most critical areas, such as the underground tunnel, made the bank easy prey. But what struck me most was the fact that, despite so many warning signs, no one acted in time. I was thinking about how, so often in life, we allow ourselves to ignore small flaws that, over time, turn into huge problems. When I started investigating, I realized that this lack of vigilance wasn't just a technical error, but also a human error. The people at the bank, who should have noticed these flaws, were so used to trusting the systems that they simply let things happen. This made me reflect on how, in our daily lives, complacency can cause us to miss opportunities or even ruin everything. How can we allow simple flaws to accumulate until we reach the point of no return? As I explored this critical flaw, I began to realize that the case was leading to more questions than answers. The lack of oversight was a consequence of a flawed system, but who was really behind this failure? Could something else be at play? And most intriguingly, was this failure caused by human error, or was there something more, something deliberate? This question was just the beginning of an even greater mystery, one that would unfold with each discovery I made. I've never underestimated the work of the police, but in the case of the robbery of the century, the distrust was palpable. At first, no one believed a heist of this magnitude could have gone unnoticed. The idea that the central bank, one of Brazil's largest and most protected banks, could be invaded by a group of criminals without anyone noticing seemed surreal. Distrust was in the air. Many thought it was impossible, that something was being hidden. How could someone plan a crime of this magnitude and not arouse suspicion, especially in such a heavily guarded bank? I found myself in a situation where, despite being an experienced investigator, I began to doubt the investigation itself. The police, as much as they wanted to believe the robbery had occurred without insider involvement, sensed there was something more behind it. All the signs were there. The lack of surveillance, the carefully dug tunnel, the erased records, and, worst of all, the lack of concrete clues that would lead us to the criminals. The feeling that someone inside the bank knew what was going on made us all suspicious of every move. The police were being cautious, but I knew that sometimes this caution could be a major obstacle to solving a case. And with each passing day, more questions arose. In my experience, I've learned that distrust is a double-edged sword. It can be the key to unearthing the truth, but it can also lead us to wrong conclusions. I was torn between what the police believed and what my intuition told me, that there was something more to this story. As the investigation progressed, I wondered, who was really in control here? Were the criminals manipulating the situation, or were the police simply following the wrong leads? And more importantly, was it possible that the answers were already right in front of us, but no one was willing to believe them? And of course, as suspicion continued to grow, an even deeper mystery emerged. Who was really behind the security breach? How did they manage to escape without a trace? And where, after all, was the money? With these questions, the case was about to take an even more intriguing turn. With each new clue that emerged, the investigation became more intricate and challenging. I was used to solving difficult cases, but the heist of the century had something unique about it. As we explored the bank and interviewed those involved, the feeling that something was being hidden intensified. It wasn't enough to examine the bank and its systems. We needed to understand the minds behind the crime. Who were these criminals? What motivated them to risk so much? The complexity of the case lay not only in the heist itself, but in the web of lies and deception surrounding it all. With every step we took, new challenges emerged, and I wondered if we would ever have complete answers. To complicate matters further, the investigation faced a series of unexpected obstacles. Documents disappeared, witnesses changed their stories, and the evidence, which initially seemed clear, became murky. During the investigation, the pressure mounted as the case attracted more media and public attention. Every move we made seemed to be watched by everyone, and in a way, this made the search for the truth even more difficult. The robbery, which seemed simple at first, revealed itself to be a psychological game, where patience and attention to detail were essential to avoid falling into the traps set by the criminals. I realized that the key to solving this case lay in the details, but also in the people involved. What seemed like a simple security breach quickly turned into a maze of manipulation and mystery. Talking to bank employees, I noticed that some were more uncomfortable than others, as if they knew more than they were letting on. This indicated that the case wasn't just about the ability to steal money, but about manipulating perceptions, as if the criminals had understood that the biggest trick wasn't just getting into the bank, but making everyone believe it was impossible to get in unnoticed. And as I delved deeper into the investigation, I began to realize that the answer lay in something few seemed to understand. Whoever was behind this heist wasn't just interested in the money, but also in control. The case was about to take an unexpected turn, revealing layers I never imagined exploring. And the next step? Well, what I was about to discover was something that could change everything we believed possible. The outcome of the robbery, if we can even call it an outcome, began to unfold slowly, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit together right away. Some of the suspects were captured, but something didn't add up. When the police arrested the first gang members, the feeling that we were close to the truth spread, but it soon became clear that the case was nowhere near closed. As the investigation continued, the questions grew, and the feeling that more people were involved grew stronger. I couldn't stop thinking, how could these few suspects be responsible for a crime of this magnitude? There was something bigger, something behind the scenes, that we hadn't yet seen. The arrest of some members of the group was an important step, but I had the feeling we were dealing with a much deeper case. The men who had been captured didn't seem to have the leadership necessary to organize something so elaborate. And then I began to look at the bigger picture. These individuals were just pawns in a much more complex game, where the true masterminds behind the robbery still remained hidden. Each arrest only raised more questions than answers, and I felt like I was chasing shadows. But most intriguing of all was realizing that, even with some members behind bars, the stolen money was never found. This made the situation even stranger. The case began to take a new turn when one of the arrests revealed a network of contacts no one had anticipated. Some of the arrested individuals began interacting with figures outside the traditional criminal circuit, suggesting that the theft was somehow linked to larger, more powerful organization. I wondered, what were these criminals trying to finance with the stolen money? What was the real purpose behind all of this? This completely changed the course of the investigation. The arrest of some, which seemed like a breakthrough, turned out to be just the surface layer of a much more intricate network, full of contacts and objectives still unknown. As new pieces began to emerge, I knew the true face of those responsible was much further away than I had imagined. What appeared to be a simple bank robbery soon revealed itself to be the first move in a larger power play involving forces beyond our comprehension. The capture of a few criminals was only the beginning. The real challenge, as I would soon discover, lay in understanding who these hidden forces were and how they had infiltrated the system so deeply. But what lay ahead was even more disturbing. We were on the right track, but the path would become increasingly treacherous. The impact of the robbery of the century went far beyond mere financial loss. Throughout the investigation, I realized that this crime left a legacy that still resonates throughout the entire banking security structure and within Brazil's financial institutions themselves. The robbery not only exposed flaws in security systems, but also exposed a system vulnerable to corruption and infiltration by highly organized criminal groups. I reflected on how a single crime could trigger a chain reaction that would change security policies forever. The legacy of the robbery lay not only in the amount stolen, but in the bitter lessons it left for all involved. And what frightened me even more was the fact that, no matter how hard the investigation tried to unravel every mystery, there was always something amiss. The stolen money was never found, and this made me wonder, did the criminals really just disappear with everything? Or was some of that money being used for something bigger, something no one had yet been able to identify? With each answer, new questions arose. The legacy of the robbery was not just about the money, but also about a void left in public trust and in the very foundations of the financial system. What seemed like a perfect heist soon became a symbol of all the flaws that could be found in a society that believed nothing could go wrong. Furthermore, the feeling of helplessness the investigation generated didn't do justice to the scale of the operation. As an investigator, I knew I was dealing with something beyond a simple robbery. This crime had been a message, a demonstration of how vulnerable we could be, despite all the security apparatus. With each new discovery, I asked myself, are we truly prepared to prevent crimes of this magnitude? Or does the legacy of the robbery of the century teach us that we're always one step behind, trying to correct flaws that are already irreparable? I knew the investigation was far from over. The robbery was just the tip of the iceberg. And what intrigued me most was the fact that, no matter how hard we tried to understand the criminals, part of what happened could never be fully explained. The crime had left a permanent mark on history, a mark of a broken system, of a moment when certainties were shattered. And no matter how much we searched for answers, there was something more behind it all, something beyond our mind's grasp. As time passed, as the investigation progressed, a controversy began to grip the media and authorities. Details about the security flaws at the central bank were being revealed, creating a climate of discomfort and tension. The bank's directors, who had initially tried to cover up the case, were now being pressured to admit the flaws that allowed the robbery to be carried out. For me, as an investigator, this was like opening a Pandora's box. Each new revelation only deepened the mystery. The transparency that should have been adopted from the beginning was being avoided, generating even more speculation and distrust. I felt that behind each new discovery was an attempt to hide something bigger, something we hadn't yet discovered. The controversy revolved around how these failures had been handled and ignored over the years. The bank had ignored clear signs that its security system was at risk, and authorities were now being forced to face the harsh reality that there was no way to hide the mistakes. However, the investigations were far from clarifying the full impact of this oversight. The failure of oversight, the lack of records at crucial moments, the lack of emergency protocols, all of this was part of a scenario that exposed not just an institutional error, but a web of poor decisions which were now being exposed to the public. I was confronted with what seemed like a war of narratives. On one side, the bank's leaders, who tried to downplay the incident, and on the other, law enforcement, who wanted at all costs to find answers and pin the blame on those responsible. Amidst this struggle, it became clear that the central bank robbery was not just a simple crime. It had exposed a major flaw in the country's financial system, and the fight was now to control the narrative. The revelation of all these details not only exposed the bank, but also raised questions about who should be held accountable. We were faced with a web of interests much wider than anyone could have imagined. This made me reflect on the role of transparency in our own lives. We're often quick to hide our flaws, whether out of fear or shame, but the truth is, when the truth comes out, it has the power to change everything. What the robbery of the century case teaches us is that when we try to hide something, we create even more mystery and distrust. And no matter how hard we tried to understand what really happened in that bank, one thing was clear: the story was far from being fully told. Each new revelation raised more questions, and each answer seemed to pave the way for something even more mysterious. After the robbery of the century, change was inevitable. Brazil's financial system, which until then seemed unshakable, was shaken to its foundations. The operation was such a precise, calculated blow that it led banks and financial institutions to completely rethink their security systems. I was on the front lines of this revolution, seeing firsthand how investigations could change not only the laws but also the security practices of an entire sector. If anyone ever thought banks were immune to attacks of this magnitude, the robbery of the century debunked that notion once and for all. They were vulnerable, and now it was time to fix the flaws before another disaster struck. What impressed me most was how quickly banks began implementing changes. New security protocols were established, and companies specializing in surveillance technology were hired to review and improve all systems. This was an immediate reaction to the attack, but it also reflected a heightened awareness of the need for continuous adaptation to threats. Banking security would never be the same again, and all of us directly involved in the investigation knew that the heist had become a turning point. But despite all the progress, a question still lingered. Were banks truly secure now, or were they simply creating a false sense of protection? This transformation also brought a broader reflection on how, often, in our own lives, we only begin to take action when something tragic happens. The robbery of the century was a wake-up call, not just for financial institutions, but for all of us. The central bank's failure served as a mirror for all security systems in Brazil, and the bank's response was a desperate attempt to correct the error, to restore the trust that had been broken. But would these changes be enough to prevent future crimes? Or will there always be loopholes that, if properly exploited, could be used to violate trust again? What I knew was that the scenario was changing, but many questions still lingered. As much as new security measures had been taken, I knew the real impact wasn't just the technologies implemented, it was the way people thought about security. The robbery of the century challenged the idea that banks were inviolable, and with it, trust was broken. Even with all the advanced systems that were installed, what really needed to change was the mindset. And as I reflected on all these changes, one question lingered in my mind: what would happen when another group of criminals, more cunning and better prepared, decided to challenge Brazil's financial system again? Were we truly prepared to prevent another robbery of the century? As the investigation deepened, a new mystery unfolded before my eyes. I began to realize that the robbery of the century was not an isolated case, but part of a much larger and more complex network of criminal organizations. While some of the criminals directly involved in the robbery were being captured, the truth was that they appeared to be mere pawns in a larger scheme involving international contacts and even partnerships with other criminal factions. This was a turning point for me. The robbery had not simply been an attack on a financial institution, but a strategic move within a much larger scheme involving multiple organized crime fronts. It was when I began reviewing the records of some of the arrested suspects that I realized many of them were connected to international networks. They weren't just bank robbers, but cogs in a machine that moved large sums of money through arms trafficking and even money laundering fronts. In my work, I've often seen how transnational crime can operate silently and meticulously, and what the robbery of the century revealed was exactly that: an organized network that knew how to operate undetected, connecting with other criminal organizations. The central bank robbery was just one strategic move within a larger power play, where money wasn't the only objective, but a way to finance and expand other illicit activities. Most alarming of all was the realization that if this operation succeeded, others could follow suit. The stolen money was being used to fund other large-scale operations, and I couldn't help but wonder, how were the security forces dealing with such a well-structured threat? If these organizations were truly behind it all, what would it take to bring them down? The investigation was revealing that organized crime was not an isolated incident, but part of a global system operating without most people even being aware of its existence. Each new detail that emerged increased the complexity of the operation, and I knew that, even with the criminals arrested, the real battle was just beginning. Through this discovery, I realized how vulnerable we are to invisible forces operating under our noses, moving strategically and meticulously, connecting different types of crimes in a coordinated fashion. When I began investigating the larger network behind the robbery of the century, I understood there was no turning back. The crime had infiltrated financial institutions and spread like a web where every move was calculated. The question that now gnawed at me was, what else could we be missing? And what else was happening behind the scenes, beyond the reach of the investigation? With this in mind, I knew the next stage would be even more intense. With each step we took in the investigation, I felt the truth slipping through my fingers like sand. No matter how many arrests were made and new clues emerged, the great mystery still lingered. Where was the stolen money? None of the captured criminals knew exactly where the money had been hidden, and the investigation was stagnant. The robbery, which seemed like a solved case as the suspects were arrested, was not resolved easily. The absence of the stolen money left many questions unanswered. With each new statement, it seemed as if the criminals were trying to protect themselves, without truly revealing the key to the great enigma that still challenged us. I couldn't help but wonder, what else was being hidden? How could someone, with so much planning and skill, steal such a huge sum and then disappear with it? The thought that the money had never been found consumed me. What were the criminals doing with it? Were they laundering the money somehow? Or perhaps it was being stashed somewhere we hadn't yet been able to trace. The fact that we never found the stolen money made me feel like the case was far from solved, and that there was a bigger secret, something deeply buried, that we still needed to unearth. What's more, the criminals who were arrested remained tight-lipped. Although some were forced to confess their involvement in the robbery, no one seemed to know what really happened to the money. This made me wonder how many mysteries in life truly have more layers than we can see at first glance. In the case of the robbery, it seemed that as more people were arrested and more details emerged, the more difficult it became to understand what really happened. And I wondered, will these answers never come? Or perhaps someone, somewhere, held the missing pieces to complete the puzzle. The truth, in the end, was that the case seemed to have no definitive conclusion. The lack of answers about the stolen money and the lingering doubts about who was truly behind the heist left a mark of uncertainty on the process. What seemed like a simple solution, with the criminals being captured, soon revealed itself to be a web of unsolved mysteries. This enigma, which persists to this day, is a reminder that often, the greatest mysteries cannot be solved with a simple solution. And as I reflected on all this, something even more disturbing emerged. What else could these criminals have planned, and where else might the web of mystery lead us? The robbery of the century wasn't just a crime that shook banking security and the Brazilian financial system. It also left a cultural and media legacy that persists to this day. As the weeks and months passed, the case grew in scale, attracting national and international media attention. Documentaries, books, and even films were produced to try to understand the criminals' audacity and ingenuity, creating a narrative that captured everyone's imagination. The robbery of the century became a cultural icon, a symbol of how planning and patience can challenge even the most impenetrable systems. But it was also a reminder of the fragility of institutions, which, however protected, can be vulnerable to a cunning mind. I myself found myself immersed in the media coverage of the case. With each new report or journalistic investigation, the story gained layers of complexity, and public perception of the robbery shifted. What had previously seemed like a failure of the banking system was now seen as a challenge to the country's laws and regulations. For me, as an investigator, this media phenomenon added a new dimension to the case. The story was being retold, and I knew that as time passed, the focus could shift from the true essence of what happened, creating a romanticized or distorted version of events. But at the same time, the media coverage helped keep the case alive, fueling the desire for justice and the search for the truth. It wasn't just about the robbery itself, but about what it represented. This event sparked a cultural reflection on security, trust, and the flaws in large institutions. Over the years, the robbery of the century has become a symbol of the potential of organized crime and the vulnerability of systems that at first glance seem foolproof. The way the criminals managed to go undetected, operating with such dexterity, led many to wonder, what if similar crimes were happening all around us, unnoticed? And more importantly, Had the institutions learned from their mistakes, or were they simply covering up their failures to prevent the truth from coming to light? Looking back at the legacy of this robbery, it's impossible not to consider how culture and media shape public perception. The robbery of the century wasn't just a crime, but a story that has perpetuated itself, becoming part of the collective imagination. This led me to reflect more deeply on how narratives about major events are often shaped by external factors, such as the media, and how these narratives can sometimes obscure the true impact of a crime. And while this story still resonated in the media, one question remained: what else had been lost or hidden in this process of retelling the story? As the layers of the robbery of the century unfolded, the investigators' work became increasingly complex. I found myself at the center of a veritable maze, trying to connect the dots and uncover the motivations, faces, and methods behind this extraordinary crime. Investigative work in a case like this is never linear. We're challenged to read between the lines, to interpret each clue, to see beyond the obvious. The robbery was meticulously planned, and with each step taken, more questions arose. For me, the biggest challenge was dealing with external pressure, with the expectation of a quick solution, while the complexity of the case demanded patience and precision. At first, the case seemed straightforward. The money was stolen, and the criminals fled. But as I investigated, the complexity unfolded before me. Each encounter with witnesses, each analysis of evidence, showed me that there were more layers than anyone could have imagined. What surprised me was the resilience of some of those involved, who, despite being captured, maintained an almost calculated silence. They were, in some way, protecting something larger, a network we hadn't yet managed to reach. This made me think that, often, the truth lies not in the obvious answers, but in the questions we're willing to ask. And increasingly, I found myself plunging deeper into this ocean of uncertainty, where each new discovery seemed to open up a new set of mystery. I knew that to get to the truth, I needed more than just physical evidence. I needed to understand the criminals' psychology, their motivations. The robbery hadn't been committed solely for money. Something more was at play, something they were willing to do silently, without leaving a trace. But what exactly was that something? This question haunted me constantly, and I knew the only way forward was to step back and analyze the situation more holistically. The investigator's job ultimately isn't just to solve crimes, but to understand the impact of human actions and the forces that drive each act. In many situations in life, the answer isn't found in the shortest or most obvious path, but in the journey you take. The investigation of the heist of the century taught me that when seeking the truth, we must be prepared to deal with the most disconcerting and challenging aspects of a case. And while I knew there was more to be discovered, I also sensed the story was moving in a direction where the greatest mystery was yet to come. What would happen when we finally put the pieces together? The robbery of the century wasn't just a lesson for banks or authorities, but for all of us. As the case unfolded, I began to realize that the true legacy of this story wasn't the amount stolen, but the lessons it leaves us with. The first, and most important, is about vulnerability. No matter how many security systems, strict protocols, and technological resources we have, we are all subject to failure. What deeply touched me, as an investigator, was the fact that, despite all the precautions, the loopholes in the system were there, waiting to be exploited, and this is something we can apply to our own lives. No matter how well planned our trajectory, there are always weak points, and the key to success lies in how we deal with these vulnerabilities. Furthermore, the case teaches us about patience and perseverance. The plan behind the robbery of the century was undoubtedly a labor of patience. For months, the criminals waited for the right moment, observed, calculated each step, and when they acted, it was with precision and efficiency. This strategy may seem destructive in the context of crime, but if we applied it to our personal lives, we would realize that the greatest successes come with time and planning. How often in life do we want a quick and immediate solution, when the real secret lies in building something solid and lasting? This kind of lesson, although tragic, is fundamental for us to understand that the key to success lies in constant preparation and the ability to wait for the right moment. The heist also reminds us of the importance of trust. When authorities began to question possible insider involvement at the central bank, what emerged was a breach of trust. Financial institutions weren't as immune as they thought. and people began to doubt the structures they had relied on for so long. This leads us to reflect on trust in our own lives. Who do you trust? How do you manage your trust in systems, people, and processes? The heist of the century was, at its core, a reflection of how our beliefs about security can be challenged, and how crucial it is to evaluate and rethink the structures that sustain our lives. Trust is a valuable currency, and once broken, it takes time to rebuild. And finally, the greatest legacy of all, the relentless pursuit of truth. In every investigation like this, we see that the path to truth is never simple. The heist of the century shows us that truth is often hidden behind multiple layers, and uncovering it requires perseverance, curiosity, and courage. The legacy of this heist is the constant reminder that, in our personal lives, we are often challenged to uncover truths we would rather not face, but which, in the end, set us free. The journey to truth, though difficult and uncomfortable, is the one that leads us to transformation. Although the robbery of the century case has been investigated and several arrests have been made, it still leaves an indelible mark on history. The story, like any great mystery, continues to unfold with each new piece of information that emerges. What leaves me feeling uneasy is the fact that, no matter how much time passes, there will always be something that hasn't been fully revealed. The investigation, however successful it may have been, in many respects, failed to provide definitive answers about where the money went. This made me reflect on the fact that, often, the story is never truly concluded. It continues, slowly and silently, as new pieces fall into place. And that's what fascinated me. The story of the robbery of the century never ends. It lives on, continually fueled by new mysteries and curiosities that have yet to be satisfied. What intrigues me most is the psychological impact this case left on those involved, especially the authorities and the victims. The scars are deep and often invisible. The sense of failure, of having been so cunningly deceived, is something that many of those involved, whether directly or indirectly, will have to deal with for the rest of their lives. But more than the visible scars, the robbery of the century also exposed something more subtle: the fragility of trust, the fear that at any moment, something so grandiose and audacious could happen again. The crime was successful not only because the criminals were skilled, but because the authorities failed to recognize the vulnerabilities within the system. And this perception of fragility will remain with us all until new lessons are learned. As the investigation deepened, more information came to light, and the case became a story that would not be easily erased. Some of the culprits were brought to justice, but the money was never found. This fact generated a cycle of questions that never ended. And although the police did their job and fulfilled their role, there is something at the end that prevents us from closing this chapter satisfactorily. The feeling that more truths are being kept secret continues to linger, like an invisible shadow. The heist of the century has no clear ending, but perhaps that is precisely what makes it so fascinating. The mystery surrounding it perpetuates itself, like a story that never stops being told. As I walked away from the case, I knew the story wouldn't end with my departure. The case would continue to be debated, explored, and analyzed by others, who might one day bring new revelations to light. I also knew that the lessons of the heist of the century weren't limited to a single crime. They were universal, applicable to us all, reminding us that wherever there is power, there is also vulnerability, and that the truth doesn't always reveal itself easily. What the heist leaves us with is the lesson that history, like life, never has a definitive ending. It continues, always challenging us to see beyond what we know, to question what we take for granted, and to seek the truth even when it seems unattainable. So, what do you think? The heist of the century case is more than just a crime story. It's a lesson in trust, planning, and vulnerability. What can we learn from all this? That often, true security lies in the awareness that there's always something more going on behind the scenes. No matter how hard we try to avoid failure, whether in our personal lives or in large institutions, there are always loopholes that can be exploited, and the big question is, are we prepared to face them? I know you're probably full of questions and ideas about this case, so tell me in the comments, what do you think really happened to the stolen money? Will we ever discover the full truth behind this audacious crime? I'd love to hear your thoughts and look forward to continuing this conversation with you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any investigative stories like this. We have many more mysteries and twists ahead, Until the next video. And remember, the truth may be closer than you think. Stay tuned.